Hey everybody, and welcome to I Can't Believe It's Not News, your favorite podcast about fake news. I'm Beth.
And I'm Kelly.
Hey Kelly, how are you today?
I'm, when this releases, probably either coming back from Ireland or I am very, very jet lagged and very tired.
Oh, well, let's take a look into the future and say, Kelly, you had such a good trip. That was so awesome.
Yay! It was so amazing. And the plane ride was so smooth coming back. Oh, that was the best. Thank you, Beth.
That was so sweet of you to bring me that huge bottle of Irish whiskey, too.
Oh, yeah, that was. I'm a very, very kind co-host.
You are. Wow. Thank you. So, what should we talk about today?
Today, we are lucky enough to have an interview with Teri Yuan from the Engendered podcast, which is a great podcast, very intersectional, very feminist, and we definitely recommend it here at I Can't Believe It's Not News.
So is her podcast fake news?
No.
What are we doing? Why are we talking to Teri?
So we're talking to Teri because last week we talked a little bit about when disinformation gets personal. And disinformation is this type of fake news that we're talking about right now. We're just doing we're trying to continue on this theme of sometimes these things that, even though they're not making the news in your life, they're still very much affecting people throughout the country, throughout the world. This seems to be a worldwide phenomenon, the thing we're talking to Teri about today.
Nice. All right. Well, let's get into it.
Yeah, let's do it. Thank you so much for being here, Teri.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, welcome, Teri.
In our last episode, we talked about how we were sort of not under attack, but we got a lot of comments following our Sarah Huckabee Sanders episode. And Beth was nice enough to post on a different podcast support group on Facebook about this issue. And Teri was one of the people we talked to, and her podcast sounded really amazing. So we thought it'd be a good idea to have her on.
Yeah. So we're kind of continuing on this theme of, it's not necessarily about fake news, because this isn't about journalistic standards or editorial processes. This is more about when fake news becomes personal. And again, going into that difference between misinformation and disinformation. Just a quick reminder. So misinformation is when false information is spread, regardless of whether the intent is to mislead. And disinformation is when it's deliberate. It's more propaganda, it's manipulative narrative or facts. And what Teri mentioned that she talks about kind of falls into that, like when disinformation happens to you.
Right.
And so we thought that was worth exploring, even though it's not necessarily about news. Is that
right?
That makes sense?
Yeah. So let's go ahead and start, and we'll begin by just, Teri, could you tell us who you are and what your podcast is?
Sure. So my name is Teri Yuan. I am an intersectional feminist, a victim and a survivor of domestic abuse. And I'm also the host of a weekly podcast called Engendered, which explores the systems, practices, and policies that enable gender-based violence and oppression and the solutions that end them. And we use gender as a lens to build a cultural literacy around power, privilege, violence, and oppression so that we can better confront it, identify it, prevent it, and hopefully heal from it.
Wow, that sounds like a really good idea that you had for a podcast. And thank you for doing that. That must be a ton of emotional labor to do.
Yes.
It's a ton of emotional labor just to be in this space. But yes, I agree. You're welcome.
Teri, do you feel comfortable talking about why you started that podcast?
Sure. So I earlier when I introduced myself, usually I say survivor, but I feel like there's some people who speak about the word survivor in the gender justice advocacy space who feel that it's actually minimizing of the victimization that people experience and whitewashing it in some ways. So I actually use that term now. Today's the first time I'm starting to use that word victim and survivor, because both of those are spaces that I continually navigate. When people use the word survivor, in theory, they're already outside of the forces of their relationship, the danger, the risk, emotionally, psychologically, financially, physically. And I'm not, because I'm currently still involved in court with my abuser. And he continues to use litigation as one of his tools to harm me. And so I use that term victim. And it's through my decade plus advocacy that I became involved in New York City's advocacy groups. One of them is called the Gender Justice Task Force. Another is the Domestic Violence Task Force, which is part of the Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence. And as a survivor member, I started off really with a lot of, I guess, positive expectation and hope, thinking that, wow, I'm part of a group of people in New York City, one of the largest cities in the country and in the world, that probably has a lot of influence regarding policy and practice. And I get to hopefully have a say in how this work is done and how we can address the problems and create, hopefully, effective solutions. And very soon after I joined, at the beginning of 2018, I became disillusioned with the process. I realized quickly that there was not this shared definition of the problem. Even the term domestic violence or domestic abuse, people have different variations of it or permutations that are not necessarily in alignment with the either criminal definitions or psychological or public health definitions, et cetera, and approaches. And so if you don't even have a common definition of what the problem is, how can you put together a common set of goals of how to fix it?
That is, if I can just say really quickly, that is exactly what we have also experienced with exploring fake news. That need for a shared definition is imperative to be able to really pinpoint what the problem is and how you can fix it.
Yeah. And so I started my podcast as really focused with the naive idea, looking back, that, hey, maybe I could create a set of materials that I think that the folks who are in this task force might want to access and use. And of course, that's not what happened. It turned out to be something that was more towards survivors and other advocates, and less so towards New York City, but more across the country and across the globe.
So you were able to evolve your approach and hopefully help lots of people with it.
I think the hard part is, and even talking about this, I'm getting a little bit emotional. The hard part about survivors of gender-based violence, is that if we aren't in a abusive or coercively controlling relationship, it's easier to leave if you don't share a child with someone. But when you do, then the child becomes part of a tool for weaponization against you. And so it becomes, in many ways, a lifetime of enslavement.
Yes.
And so a lot of the people who would be target listeners are constantly in crisis, moving in and out of crisis. And that may be one of the reasons why they're not as engaged. I mean, many of them actually have reached out to me either through the social media post and making comments, or emailing me to tell me how much some of the divorce and custody episodes have really opened their eyes, which I think is great. But, for us to make systemic change, the information that I'm sharing, which is best practices that are aggregated, across decades of research, across different sectors of public health and criminal justice and advocacy, have to get out to not just the survivors, but also the practitioners, the advocates, the policymakers, the elected officials, and people who are part of the community, who are family and friends and coworkers of survivors, so that they can develop this familiarity and an appreciation for how it actually is relevant to them as well.
I think that's one of the great things about doing it as a podcast is that people can go back and listen at any time to your previous episodes that will help them with understanding it.
Right.
And I definitely feel the same way with our podcast and, helping to try to give some information out there about fake news and what people can do. And it's nice that they can go back and listen to some of our prior episodes and get that progression that we have gone through with understanding that process. And I've tell Kelly all the time, I feel like every week it's like we do a book report for the podcast. And I'm sure you feel the same way where you do this research and then it becomes part of you. And going forward, it helps affect your decisions. And like you said at the beginning, like you're even starting to not just refer to yourself as a survivor, but as a victim and survivor. And that's an evolution for you as well. It's nice to have it in that format where people can go listen and understand, because you're absolutely right. It does need to be a change that's going to evolve people's thinking about this. And I'm sure even a lot of actual survivors and victims don't even understand it themselves. And they haven't put it into that terms that you're putting it into. So it can be very helpful to have this medium to help people understand and put a name to it and describe it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the biggest challenges, is that everybody is at a different place in their journey towards quote unquote wokeness, about the ways in which their personal experiences are actually very common because of systemic sexism and misogyny. And so as a culture, I think if you're socialized, to behave a certain way, and then you add all of the personal elements of, demographics and religion and, all of the specifics that one grows up with, it can insulate you from being open to even recognizing when information's being shared that's relevant to you. And so I think, that sort of awakening is so important. And that's why one of my taglines is my podcast is, it teaches feminism to decolonize hearts and minds one story at a time, because we are all colonized by patriarchy. And part of the goal is to sort of peel the layers on the onion so you can get to what's, underneath. And once you do that, you see that there's so many common experiences that we have that abusers use. Literally, I have a hashtag abuser tactics, the same tactics all across the world. These are the same tactics of, gaslighting and manipulation and using various systems against the survivor as she's trying to leave and seek support. And so it's so frustrating to be able to see that different people are at different points of their journey, and you just wish that you could hurry them along, so that they can make the decision that's safe for them.
So, Teri, in the vein of all of this, the misinformation and the ingrained patriarchy and misogyny, we had discussed a topic that I had never heard of this before. And I did a little dive into it the other night. And I was wondering if you could explain what parental alienation syndrome is and why it could be considered fake news, sort of in the vein of we know it's not really fake news, but it is sort of that same disinformation that we were talking about earlier.
Yes. So it definitely falls within the realm of disinformation because it's deliberate. I don't know too much about the history of how it came about. I do know that the person who coined the term, Dr. Richard Gardner, was a very controversial figure who had very controversial beliefs, especially around pedophilia, and he eventually committed suicide. And so there was some element of him being either aligned with or funded by people who are in the men's rights activist movement, the MRA, who actually support fathers' rights supremacists. And so so we're able to give the listeners more information. I did share with you a article by the former president of the American Psychiatric Association, Dr. Paul J. Fink, about PAS, where he talks about Richard Gardner's sort of coining of the phrase and some background and his controversial beliefs, and then offers, sort of the flip side. And so what PAS is essentially the weaponization by abusers of the abuse that they inflict and the trauma reactions to that abuse. So as an example, this usually shows up in family court and in custody issues where a survivor is a victim of domestic violence, potentially her children are also being abused in many circles. And I'm one of those who believe that if you engage in domestic violence with your partner, that is also a form of child abuse. So by definition, there's child abuse if there's domestic violence.
Right.
And so when that survivor is trying to protect herself and or her children from the abuser's tactics, possibly trying to leave and get a divorce or just leave in general, very often if she ends up in the court system, the abuser will then accuse her of quote unquote parental alienation, which basically the equivalent is kind of like Trump using the term fake news to discredit mainstream media reporting facts that he doesn't like about him. So it's a way to weaponize both the victimization and the response, because usually when you're traumatized by abuse, you're going to exhibit symptoms of trauma that most people don't. Lay people and even mental health professionals, and certainly throughout the court system, they don't have the either expertise or desire to develop the expertise to assess and recognize. And so when you're exhibiting symptoms of trauma and you want to protect yourself from the abuser, and you may want to tactically do that by asking for supervised visitation for the abuser will then say, well, you are trying to keep me from my child, quote unquote, alienate me from my child. And it's harmful to my child because the abuse is false. It's not true. And look, you're willing to go so far as to make up lies about me to keep me from my child. And because so many states in this country have a quote unquote friendly parent provision, which is a criteria that determines custody, one of the many criteria. And so if you, in theory, are not, willing to communicate with the other parent, willing to share information, or if you do it indirectly, then it could be held against you. And so in theory, many states who have these provisions also have separate either case law or other statutory law that makes exceptions for domestic violence. So you're supposed to actually kind of filter first whether there's a domestic violence case before applying those criteria. And what happens is, because there's not a good process and not skilled people who are assessing domestic violence, these cases fall through the cracks and end up as being just quote unquote high conflict cases, which are not the same as domestic violence, which is about power and control. And high conflict is about two parties coming together and trying to, fight for power equally. And so they get mislabeled and mistreated. And research, that's been conducted by a professor of law at George Washington University, Joan Meyer, who started the nonprofit DV Leap, Domestic Violence Legal Empowerment Appeals Project. She just came out with research that shows what we all know as survivors and protective parents, which is that when you make a claim of abuse, child abuse or child sexual abuse, the court's not going to believe you. Usually it's the father who's the abuser is going to claim alienation. and the alienation is going to be given more weight, and you're going to lose custody. And then essentially your child is going to be, forced to be living with the abuser.
Right. And I think that Joan, is it Joan Mayer? Joan Meyer?
Meyer. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So I think that Joan Meyer study you were talking about, I think that they mentioned that in the Washington Post article that you shared it. And then I had also found it when I was doing the research on this article, because I wanted to find something that is as close to today or as close to our release date as possible to show this is an ongoing thing. Do you know, we were having a hard time trying to find her final study details. Do you know if it's published already or if it's getting ready to be published?
It's getting to be ready to be published. There's a interim version, and then there's the PowerPoint deck that I shared with you, which you're welcome to share on your website.
Okay.
In the interim, and then just update it with the final study. But I think that the date that it was supposed to be due to the National Institute of Justice, the funder, was closing out all the data by the end of June. So I'm guessing within the next month or so, she should have the final research study. And certainly I'll share it on my website, and I'm happy to share it with you to make sure that your listeners have access to it as well.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
So I want to just break in really quick and just mention the Washington Post article is called "A Gendered Trap: When Mothers Allege Child Abuse by Fathers, the Mothers Often Lose Custody, Study Shows." And this came out just on July 29th of 2019 by Samantha Schmidt. And Teri, really quick, what is your website? Do you want to mention that right now so our listeners could go there if they'd like to?
Sure. So it's engendered, engendered.us. So engenderedus.us.
Perfect. Thank you. So this Washington Post article that you shared and then Kelly found as well was a very good, I think, kind of breakdown of a time when there was a woman who felt that her child was in danger. She was trying to keep her child away from the abusive ex-boyfriend. The court didn't really believe her, and he ended up killing the child. So definitely a very emotional case that had happened. And it's what they're saying in here is going through some of the study is that there's some pretty high percentages of when a mother goes to court and says there is child abuse and or sexual abuse, they're still pretty highly likely to lose custody.
Yes. And, I also want to call out that there's an article that I shared in the New York Times, which came out recently as well. Yes. And that case took place in Queens Family Court, where I'm currently still involved. And so on a systemic level, there are lots of problems because that referee, so there's judges and there are referees, and referees are sort of like lower level judges. And when you appear before them, you have the right to give them consent to hear and determine your case and give the final outcome of your case, or you can decide you want them to hear and then have a judge review and decide the case. And most people say hear and determine, which is, what this woman, Autumn Coleman, did with her referee. And the referee that's featured in this article that this journalist is going to thankfully, continue to research and explore is not atypical at all. And I want to make that very clear. Like the people in family court, there's a reason why people call it kangaroo court, because there's no accountability whatsoever, up, down, left, and right. And these referees, I was in a recent meeting where people were talking about this case, lawyers who represent domestic violence victims in New York City. And, she was characterized as making decisions by the seat of her pants, by not looking at evidence, by not listening to the litigants, And so when you're talking about cases where there's domestic violence or child abuse and you don't look at the evidence or you don't engage in a fair process where there's due process, that has potentially deadly consequences. And it doesn't have to be that someone is killed, in this case, it was the child's father trapped the child in a burning car, and the child died despite this mother asking for supervised visitation weeks earlier, right? And having her pleas ignored. But people can die slowly day to day. I mean, in some ways, I feel like I'm dying, but I try to keep my spirit alive for my son, because every day when you're trying to sort of speak out and speak truth to power, especially, people are going to discredit you and engage in this disinformation campaign. And once you have like the fruit of the deadly tree, people are eating it, a poisonous tree, it stays poisonous. So it takes a lot to sort of disabuse people of the myths that they have held on to, that they're so emotionally connected to.
Yeah, and I want to mention just really quick, so the New York Times article that you were talking about is called "She Went to Court to Save Her 3-Year-Old Daughter. Days Later, the Child Was Dead." And this was, again, just from July 22nd, 2019 by Nikita Stewart. So both of these cases are very currently being talked about. This, like Kelly and Teri had mentioned, this is something that has been ongoing. And as Teri has mentioned, this is something that people are now maybe starting to understand and look at. And I do have a question, Teri, and I maybe as a little bit of a devil's advocate here, just to talk about it. Is there any truth to parents alienating their kids from the other parent? I mean, that seems like that would be a very easy form of abuse where, somebody's keeping their child from the other parent or turning them against them by telling them lies about them and those kind of things.
Well, I would say that there's the term. So just like fake news is not real. I don't like, those of us who work in this space don't like giving light to terms that have no credibility. And so what actually is going on in those cases is, I think, what we should call it what it is. So when an abuser is trying to keep, in my case, my abuser is trying to keep my son away from me. And when he does that, but then yet he's accused me of doing the same, it's actually called coercive control. And Evan Stark, who's a forensic social worker, has written about coercive control, and he's done lots of research, and his work actually helped to criminalize coercive control in various parts of Great Britain, in England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. And he's actually working on a book right now about coercive control with children, because whenever there's coercive control by an abuser towards a victim, the children are also being coercively controlled. And so that's what I would call it. So when the abuser is making false allegations of parental alienation when a survivor is talking about abuse, that's just abuse, because it's lies. And it's a form of trying to weaponize the system against her, to disbelieve her, to discredit her. And when the abuser is actually engaging in behaviors to keep the child from the safe parent, the protective parent, that's just coercive control towards the child and towards the parent. Now, when you're in a situation where it's not domestic violence, where there's no power and control issue, and you may have, possibly a high conflict situation where both parents are, like I said, struggling for power, and they may engage in those tactics, I would just call that manipulation.
Right.
Because that is manipulation. And so, but the way that parental alienation has evolved over the years has become so dangerous, because it's been normalized in the mental health community to some extent. And there's this cottage industry of people who make money off of it, who believe in it, who support it, who teach and receive continuing ed credit for listening to these kinds of workshops, which I think is outrageous, because the American Psychological Association has for years has said, no, parental alienation is not a medical diagnosis and it should not be in the DSM.
That's right. And
right? But
That's
abusers
right.
have been keep trying to get it on. And now we have, I don't know what's happening now, but as in May, apparently the World Health Organization was trying to, was considering putting parental alienation in as a guideline, which I think is crazy. That's like fucked up. So, I mean, I don't
Right.
know what else. It's
Right.
like, it's like having journalists come together and saying, let's, have a ban against fake news. There's no such thing as fake news. There's propaganda and there's news.
Right.
But they're not, propaganda is not news.
Right.
Right. I mean, and one of the things I even was reading last night was someone had written a blog post, and he's some PhD. So, of course, they have to keep their blogs going somehow. But he was saying, should parental alienation be criminalized? And I thought, well, that's even worse because, at a certain point, you're saying, okay, well, we're taking this side over this side, and now you get to go to jail, not just lose your child. And not just have your child possibly be harmed by your abuser. Now you get to be criminalized as well, which is just seems like even further up the rungs of that, because it largely happens from the male side. I'm going to go ahead and say that I believe that it is true, that it just goes further up the rungs of patriarchy and misogyny against women that's built into the system, because even when you get female judges, they can often, there's such this backlash against the idea that, oh, mothers always get custody. But the more research I did, the more it seemed as though women oftentimes get custody because they don't, and it's not even all the time. It's usually like 51% of the time women get primary custody. And that's largely outside of even the courts because both the parents have agreed on that.
Right. So when it comes to, I'm glad you brought that up. So when you have both parties consenting, those are not the cases we're looking at. Right. The cases that go to litigation, the majority of them have some abuse allegation. And when there's an abuse allegation, those survivors, those people making the claims of abuse are going to lose custody based on the research that Joan Meyer did. And I want to say that your example is very much similar to what's happening across this country with regard to reproductive justice. Yeah. You have lots of, it doesn't matter who it is. There are lots of women. Look at Alabama, the judge and the, elected officials who proposed the bill. People all across this country, what this PAS is part of that set of tools that is being used to control women. And part of the narrative is that, you shouldn't speak out. You're disobeying the head of the household. And there's also some sort of historical basis that the religious right was involved in funding these efforts, especially fatherhood initiatives and efforts in order to preserve the nuclear family. This has been going on for decades. And so when you're looking at the cases of abuse and those that go to litigation, this problem has been going on for the past 50 years. And Phyllis Chesler wrote a book in the 80s called Mothers on Trial. And at that point, it had been going on for decades. Wow. And so the disinformation campaign, or the misinformation campaign, I should say, from mainstream media is this myth that mothers get custody, but that was only until the 70s, until the end of the tender years doctrine. And then there were some really stringent laws that came into place to enforce child support. And so the combination of those two things gave abusers a new tactic. If you want to avoid child support, you fight for custody, and then you get control of everything. And so I think I want to say this very explicitly. PAS is the most dangerous thing that women survivors of domestic violence face right now in this country. There's no disputing it because it has been so institutionalized in the system that if you want to leave your abuser and you have a child, you will be traumatized and re-traumatized, and all the players in the system are going to be enabling your trauma. And there are institutions, I also shared with you, there's a PAS conference, which is fucked up as well, where people are coming together to it's like if you were to imagine all of the GOP coming together and making up lies about the Mueller report and then, institutionalizing it and saying, this is what it is. And let's have a conference about how we can't have, special counsel anymore, whatever. I mean, that's a bad analogy, but it's essentially like lots of people in power with influence and decision-making ability, giving more power to the abuser.
Yeah.
To me, as I was reading all the stats and as I was reading what happens in the courts when women do tell the legal system that, hey, my child is being abused, or, hey, my ex was accused of molesting children and I think my child is experiencing sexual abuse. I want you to provide supervised visitation. And those women are getting the backlash. It seems almost victim blaming, as though, well, you couldn't protect your child, so we're just going to put your child with an abuser. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that they're not? I know that there's a level of misogyny. I know that there's a level of patriarchy. I know that that's all ingrained in the system and is hard to root out. But why do you think it is that there's this misconception when someone is abusing? Do you think that they just don't believe, or, oh, I hear this all the time. Oh my God, I'm so sick of it. You guys, you ladies just bring this up when you want to get sole custody. Is it that, or is there more?
I feel like there's a lot of things going on here, at play at the same time. So on the one hand, you're right. Yes, there is victim blaming, and that shows up a lot. It's the similar kind of victim blaming that shows up in rape culture, when you want to report sexual assault. And it also shows up in the child protective services realm, where women who are trying to leave abusive relationships get their children taken away from them because they did not keep their children safe from the abuser. Maybe because they refused to leave, or maybe because they did leave and they're in shelter and the shelter isn't safe for them or is adequate for them to raise their children. Meanwhile, the abuser gets to have visitation with the children that have been taken away and put in foster care, or in many cases too, the abuser actually gets custody. So it's really this twisted, Handmaid's Tale scenario that plays out in so many different parts of our culture that we are not aware of. And so there's that element, but there's also the element that I think people are just ignorant about what domestic violence is. They think that it's just physical. And for, many, many years, people have defined violence as being physical, domestic violence as being physical only. And if you have it's based on injury. And if you don't have an injury, then you must not have been harmed. And there's no weight given to the totality of harms that include the psychological harm to your soul, to your spirit, emotional and psychological verbal abuse. And so getting back to Evan Stark defines coercive control as a gendered liberty crime. It's not about what someone does to you. It's about what someone keeps you from doing for yourself. And if you see it as an issue of power dynamics where one person has more power and is exerting power through domination, intimidation, isolation, or regulation, then you can see that the other person who's being controlled really doesn't have the full freedom to exercise choices on her own behalf or on her children's behalf. And if you see it as like a human rights issue, then it becomes very clear. But because we're looking at it as, where's the red mark or where are the bruises, people just diminish it. And I think that's partly a result of the media not reporting it correctly. And to me, I'm horrified that you have people reporting on domestic violence who don't have expertise and training in it. Like, you don't have a sportscaster reporting on baseball or football who doesn't know what the rules of the game are. So why is it that we're allowing regular journalists to cover DV without having any basis in trauma and domestic violence dynamics?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
What you're talking about with the emotional violence, basically, that's perpetrated against so many women and children, it is important to recognize that. And it just really makes me think of gaslighting is such a it's almost funny because I think before Trump, we didn't really hear about it in kind of the mainstream media. And
Right.
now people
It was
talk about,
reserved a lot for dating.
yeah, people
Yeah.
talk a lot about gaslighting now. And it's always ironic to me when I have to give Trump credit for bringing something out into the open, but he has, by his horrible behavior, opened this conversation of what is gaslighting and how does it affect people. And Teri, I'm wondering your thoughts on that, with as far as the emotional abuse and gaslighting and how much that affects these relationships.
Well, I think, I wrote, so 2016, November 2016 was a very deeply painful time for me because that was when my abuser kidnapped my son, and then it coincided with the election, and
Oh my gosh.
so my emotional response to the election, thinking about it now, my God, is, this, it was like Kafkaesque, because I felt like this cannot be, the narrative that abusers win,
Yeah.
because in all of the circles that I travel through, abusers win because of the whole family court crisis. And I am a protective mother, and so I know a lot of protective mothers, and the problem is that even when they're being gaslit, unless you have a framework for analyzing, for critically analyzing and dissecting, that these are tactics that are used across, all different spaces. And it's about abuse of power. And that's what that domestic violence is. So I did an interview with a journalist, an author named Lita Han Fincher, about her two books, Leftover Women and Betraying Big Brother, where she talks about Chinese feminists who are incarcerated. And what was really powerful from reading those books and talking to her is how conscious these feminists are of the tactics that the Chinese state apparatus is using to control them. The same tactics that they use, which are isolation, intimidation, regulation, and surveillance, these are the same things. This is essentially state coercive control. And these are the same tactics that are happening in personal, individual relationships of domestic violence that are coercively controlling. And so the problem is that unless we, can draw connections between different spaces and realize, like, hey, also when I'm in the workplace, when, there's this movement to, by people who are labor activists, to end forced arbitration. Like when you sign an employment clause, there's already obviously an imbalance between the employer and the employee. In many states, there's at-will employment. So you need protections to even the playing field. And if your employment contract requires you to have arbitration as the only means of resolution and not civil litigation, then that already disadvantages you. And so those are similar tactics that are being used now with domestic violence victims and to offer restorative justice, which is by definition coercive because of the power and control dynamics. So it's like people need to make connections across all these different spaces, that it's not a personal thing or it's not a political thing. Like domestic violence is a public health issue. It's a social issue. And we all need to be aware of it, because if you don't care, you might actually be victimized. You might actually be hurt, and you might actually die as a bystander, because a mass shooter came, to hunt down his girlfriend, and you happen to be the coworker of his girlfriend. or whatever. I mean, any of these cases can show up in the public realm. And so to say, oh, that's a political thing, what's happening with Trump. No, it's not political. He is the abuser in chief, predator in chief, rapist in chief. And what he does, when you're talking about gaslighting, my first reaction when the election happened was, oh my God, he is going to be ushering in a whole generation of boys who abuse and who are going to be rapists and potentially domestic abusers, because they are modeling themselves after what he is normalizing. And so that is what we need to care about. And so getting back to answer your question about the, sort of gaslighting, I think the problem is that there's so much of what happens in power dynamics in this country that's with regard to race and gender and immigration and all these things that we have somehow defined and framed as the other and not being relevant to me. And all of these things are relevant to me and to all of us, because it's all about the dynamics of power and how they could be misused or abused. And we all are subject to it, because unless you're like a billionaire and the richest person in the world, you can be subject to abuse of power in any realm. And people just emotionally can't handle it, which is why they look away and they want to align themselves with power, like some of the Trump supporters, and they're fear-based, and so I feel like this is why you and I have these conversations and why we have these podcasts, is to basically, shine a light on the darkness and give people information that hopefully will shift them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We have to keep doing this.
Yeah, we really do. And I have to tell you, if you have a few minutes, I just want to, I don't want to relay this as though it has anything to do with your situation, because it doesn't. This is a different time. You're in a different state. And, I will keep every finger I have crossed that nothing like this ever happens to you. But I will tell you a very personal story of something that happened in my own family, because for some reason in my family, kidnapping is rampant. I don't know why that is. And I didn't even realize it was weird until I was with my husband and my family was joking around about it one time. And he was like, "What do you mean people kidnap your kids?" And it was just this thing that every single one of the grandkids on my mom's side of my family, we had all been kidnapped by fathers. My father took me for 3 weeks before he was like, "I can't even do this," and dropped me off at his mom's house. And that's where my mom found me, was in there's a whole family story of this. And then my aunt's ex-husband did the same thing with her son. And that was a really long time that he was kidnapped. And he had been told that his mother was dead. And so when they went to court for custody, the judge said it would be too much of a strain on him to place him back with his mother. So we're going to give him back to his father for sole custody.
Oh, wow.
And that was in the 80s. That was how, so when people say mothers always get custody, I'm like, when does that always happen? Because my father didn't want custody. He wanted to kidnap me to hurt my mom, but he never ever wanted custody. Like, even when he had me for the weekends, he would drop me off at his mom's house. It was never about, and that was just my dad. But there's so many examples of this. And I just want you to know, I understand what you're saying. And I understand that heartbreak. I remember, even as a very, very young child, I have a very vivid memory of being in a car in the backseat with my grandmother. And there was a car in front of us that had my aunt and my mom. And I think my uncle was driving us. And we were staking out the place where we thought my cousin was. And as soon as he came outside, my aunt ran up and grabbed him, got him in the car, and they took off in 2 cars going 2 separate directions. So, it's this mentality of control that even if he wasn't beating the shit out of her, which he was, and that's why she left, but even if he wasn't doing that, the simple fact is the court said, well, he put notices in the newspaper saying that he was divorcing you and taking sole custody, but he could do it in the 3 surrounding counties. He didn't have to do it in the county where she lived.
Oh, jeez.
So there was no way for her to know what was going on. And I want to share that because this isn't a new phenomenon. This isn't something that happened 2 days ago. This is something that happened back in the early 80s. My cousin was 2 years old. His dad continued to be the asshole that he was. He's never done anything with his life. And, he really wrecked my cousin just having custody. And it was 100% about control and never about, oh, I just really love this kid. Because he did the same thing. He just dropped his kid off at his parents' house.
When people get divorced, the last, and there's children involved, a lot of times, especially when there's one party that is really separated, like they don't want anything to do with that person, they're really ending that relationship. The children are the last link, and it's the only way that parent can still control the other one and still have that link that can hurt them, that can control them, that can coerce, everything. And it's horrifying when parents take that over their child's well-being and emotional stability and their lives. Like, to use the child in that way is just incredibly selfish on the surface and horrifying underneath, where you're literally messing that person up for your whatever you want to make that person hurt, for having the audacity to divorce you, I think is what it comes down to a lot.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that, Kelly. It's like I said, it's been going on for over 50 years, and people don't see, like you're talking about your cousin, people don't see that there's this damage that's happening daily. And I think that that's part of what we need to do to change the system, is to have accountability measures where outcomes of people's lives actually are included in the equation, not just whether people are alive or not. Because, there are a lot of people. There was another famous case which happened last year where this woman who was the wife of a colonel, and, she lost custody and she committed suicide this year on Mother's Day. And, many of us just struggle daily with being able to stay strong for our children. And part of it is so that, what keeps us going is that we want to be there when they come back to us, hopefully at some point. But in the meantime, everybody else who's in these kids' lives, they need to be aware of what's happening so that they can be a support too. And they have to recognize, like so many people who talk about Trump, they talk about negotiation and sort of giving him this chance or that chance. And I like to use the analogy of dealing with abusers, which, if you are someone who has lived with an abuser and gone through the torture that you have, that they don't care. They're not going to negotiate. Their end goal is your personal destruction, just like Trump's is. So, having any kind of strategy or tactics that's going to give the other person kind of the benefit of the doubt is only going to put you at risk. And unfortunately, that's not a lesson that people learn until they've been in that experience. And I wish that they would learn it. And that's partly why I'm, hoping to share this information so that people can have the seed planted in them that these are how people are. And it's about power and control. and it's not about the children, and they're just a pawn, and we need to be able to stop enabling it so that we're not creating generations of traumatized survivors and children who are going to, use their trauma and act out in negative, harmful ways to society.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely.
Well, Teri, again, I want to thank you for going through this emotional labor with us and for doing it on your podcast. And is yours a weekly podcast every 2 weeks, or how often do you have episodes?
It's weekly. I try to make it weekly, although it's challenging.
Yeah, ours is every 2 weeks, and that's challenging, so I can imagine. But, I think you're bringing a really important light to something that, as Kelly mentioned, she'd never heard of it. I'd never heard of it. This is important work that you're doing, and that the information needs to get out there because there is this disinformation out there about this parental alienation syndrome, and it does need to be debunked, and the real information does need to be out there. And it sounds like you, first of all, know your shit, and second of all, are passionate about making sure that other people know it too. And so you are making a difference, whether or not you feel like it on a daily basis. You are doing a great service to people. So thank you.
Thank you both so much for inviting me to be on the show and sharing these important topics.
Yeah. Well, before you go, we like to do a little segment at the end because sometimes we talk about these heavy subjects like this.
Yes.
And we like to end it on, or at least we try to end it on a little bit of a light note. So our tagline is spread jam, not lies. And we always like to do a segment that we call spreading jam. And so we tend to share either a song or a book or a TV show that we've been watching, and just anything. It can be literally jam. So we wanted to ask you, what
it could be
is
good food.
Yeah, it can be anything. What is Teri's jam of the week?
Sure. So I have so many, but let me see if I can kind of narrow it down. So I love Pink's "What About Us." I think it's a very empowering song. It has a very upbeat tempo, and it really helps me be uplifted when I'm hearing it because it really is talking about the collective and what we need to do collectively as a community, as a society, to make change. And
right.
And then in terms of books, I'm actually working through Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Marie Brown, which is a follow-up to her book, Emergent Strategy. And the idea there is that doing social justice work and doing any kind of activism is not sustainable unless there's joy in it. And there's different ways that, she helps us to sort of explore how we can create joy and pleasure in our daily lives so that we can do this work.
Nice. Well, those are both really great jams. Thank you for sharing them with us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a big reader, so I will definitely check out that book. I know the song, and the song is fantastic.
Yeah.
But I listen to more books than I do listen to music. So I think that's really great. Do you want to give your jam?
Yeah, we can do it now.
On?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so my jam this week is a song called Stars by XX. And this is just a for pleasure song, and that's it. I love this song. I would hear it come across my Pandora, and I had to look it up. And it's one of those where I can just throw it on in the background on repeat when I'm doing something and just have the melody just kind of sink in. And so it's definitely got this very low melodic quality about it. And the lyrics, when you look into it, it's kind of like, should we have sex on the first date? Which isn't necessarily the vibe that I'm putting out there. The song itself, the melody, just the way it flows is very kind of haunting and definitely a little sexy and something that I like listening to. So
yeah,
it sounds like a nice summer jam.
Yeah,
thank
that's
you.
a good summer jam.
my jam of the week is I was looking at this and I was like, well, I think that since this seems to want to root itself in patriarchy, I'm going to think of the person that I feel like is the exact opposite of that. And so I'm going to recommend Becoming by Michelle Obama, because I feel like if there's ever a book that will make you remember how important it is to be a strong woman, that is the book. And also, lighten it up a little bit and remind you that we once did have a president who cared. It will happen again.
True.
And, just the idea of the struggle that she went through and what she was able to overcome just growing up where she grew up and having a parent with a disability and not having all the resources that everyone has and still being able to do what she did with her life is pretty amazing. And it's an inspiring story no matter what.
I agree.
And for once, I can actually second your jam there. I've actually read it.
Yay!
Teri, I am an avid reader. I just like to read for forgetting instead of remembering. So I tend to not always read the heavy hitter books, but I loved Becoming. It was an amazing book. And I was so sad, like when it moved off the nightstand and I didn't have it to go to anymore, because it's such a beautiful written story and amazing. I actually remember feeling down, of course, about some of the things that Trump has taken away that they put into place. And then I went to my kids' school and there was the little school community garden there. And I thought, you know what? He hasn't taken everything.
Yeah.
He can't take every seed that they planted because some of them are beyond him.
Right.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right.
Well, that's a great thought to keep in mind as we navigate our daily travails.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Teri, thank you so much again for coming on, and tell us again really quick, how can our listeners connect with you? Do you have a Facebook page or Twitter or website? What do you have?
So you can go to my website, engendered, engendered.us, and all the links to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I have a Medium blog post where I reflect upon feminist issues in society and culture. And I'm on most of the podcast apps. So anywhere you listen to your podcasts, you should be able to find me.
Perfect. Well, we will definitely post that on our blog and make sure that people have the link to go listen and see your social media. And you can find us at podcastfakenews.com. Our Gmail is podcastfakenews@gmail.com. We're on Facebook and Twitter at Podcast Fake News. And we are always, we would love to hear your comments. We don't necessarily need you to troll us. It's always an experience. Thank you. Yeah.
We'd love for you to listen before you comment.
Yeah, right.
At least for one episode.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us. And until next time, don't forget, spread jam.
Not lies.